Warhammer 40,000 Warpforge is a free-to-play digital collectible card game set in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Now, the developers of the game reached out to sponsor a video on my channel to get my initial impressions of the game, as somebody must have told them that Warhammer 40,000, albeit my main obsession, collectible card games like Magic the Gathering are a very close second. As of today, the demo for the game is live on Steam and will run from January 19th until the 22nd. If you want to try it out for yourself, I've included a link to the game's Steam page in the description of this video. As of the time of this recording, the demo contains 3 playable factions, but the developers have promised that they plan on bringing all of the notable factions from Warhammer 40K to the game. Considering that this video is sponsored and it's just a demo, I'm gonna wait for its full release to give it a proper review and a number score. This is more a video based on my initial impressions of the game and what I think it does well and what I think needs improvement. Sugarcoating anything would be a disservice to the viewer and to Everguild, as if there's stuff that is objectively bad in this game, now is the time to make changes before it fully releases. So all that being said, is Warpforge the card game of my dreams, or just another dud in a long line of ambitious yet ultimately disappointing Warhammer games? Let's find out. As anyone who knows me in real life can tell you, I've always been a big fan of card games, and I have a crippling addiction to Magic the Gathering. So that's where the majority of my experience with games like this comes from. The demo sees you take control of one of 9 famous warlords from 3 legendary factions within 40k. The playable factions in the demo include the Orks of the Goth clan, the Necrons of the Sawtek dynasty, and the Ultramarines. Each of the 9 playable warlords has a couple of different unique decks for you to play with, each with their own themes and different playstyle. Supposedly, there are many more currently in development, and the Steam page claims that eventually all of Warhammer's factions will eventually be put into the game. How many of them are going to be available at launch is still undetermined, as the developers have remained mostly tight-lipped on this. Now, anyone who's played a card game like this will already have a good understanding of its mechanics. You generate resources each turn, which in turn allow you to play more powerful cards as the game progresses. The objective of each match is straightforward: be the first to slay the enemy warlord. Now, to do this, players will summon forth dozens of iconic units and deploy powerful stratagem cards to build up an unstoppable army that crushes all in their path. Each of the warlords differ from one another by having a unique ability that normally takes the form of a one-time use card. This will always be placed in your hand at the beginning of each turn. The abilities on these cards can range from doing direct damage, summoning in free troops, drawing additional cards, or even moving particular cards to the top of your deck. The resource in the game is known as energy. You use this to play all of your cards, each of which cost a specific amount, indicated by the number in the top right corner of each card. The stronger the card, the more energy it costs to cast. On each of your turns, your energy will completely refill, and the cap will increase by 1 up until a maximum of 10. This is actually pretty refreshing. As someone who's played a lot of Magic, this gives a very predictable curve in your card drops throughout the course of a match, and it means if you draw an opening hand with a lot of high-cost cards, you're not necessarily screwed. You know exactly when you'll be able to make use of those cards, and you're not reliant on a random amount of resources generated by the luck of the draw. What's really interesting about the way these cards work is that they don't just have a single attack value, they actually have a ranged and melee attack. Whenever you attack with one of your troops, you can declare which attack value you're going to use. Then them and their target will both deal that damage to each other. Now, some troops are well balanced and will have the same value on both of these numbers, while others are far more focused on a certain type of damage. A unit like a Necron Flayed One, for example, does 4 melee damage but 0 ranged, meaning for their cost, they hit way harder in melee than they have any right to. But if somebody attacks them with even the weakest of ranged weapons, they'll deal no damage back, making them easy prey for even terrible ranged enemies. But conversely, if they get to attack in melee, they're gonna hit like a truck. It seems like a really small change to have 2 different attack values, but it opens up a huge array of different strategies. Additionally, when your troops take damage in this game, they don't just heal back up to full at the end of your turn. The damage stays in place. You'll have to use cards that heal your troops in order to bring them back to full HP. The game smartly chooses to forgo a bunch of overly complicated interactions that are unique to each and every card, to instead have faction-specific attributes that all trigger in a similar way when their conditions are met. For the most part, everything is pretty self-explanatory, and you can just jump in and start laying down cards without having to dedicate an enormous amount of time to studying card interactions and watching a whole bunch of theory crafting videos on YouTube like in some other card games. I love Magic the Gathering, but I can only imagine how unbelievably complicated and intimidating it must be to try to get into it nowadays. Especially considered that in 2023, every Magic card that comes out, even on the most simplest of creatures, has a paragraph of text. This isn't the case for Warpforge, and I found after about 20 minutes or so, I had a complete understanding of how the game was played. Let's take a look at the humble Necron Scarab for an example of those triggering effects. Now, a Scarab doesn't seem scary at first, but their special ability allows them to multiply whenever you use a stratagem. What this means for the Scarab is that with a few well-placed cards, you can make a tidal wave of these adorable little monsters, and then play a further stratagem that causes them all to detonate. Another really interesting thing about the card interactions in this game is that the position you place them on the field matters. Smart positioning marks the difference between a novice and a master general. Many cards have aura-like effects that directly benefit troops adjacent to them. These buffs can range from additional shielding or damage, or even the ability to resurrect fallen troops in their vicinity. Likewise, certain cards have cleaving type effects like Blast that allow them to do splash damage on any foes adjacent to their target. I find this a lot of fun, and it definitely reflects the environment of Warhammer 40K better than having to read over a bunch of cards that are on the field and try to figure out how they're going to interact with one another. I have a massive cannon that does splash damage, and depending on which direction I aim it, that's what's going to get hit. Or conversely, if I play a bodyguard type card, it's going to block for whoever I place it next to. These mechanics add a lot of depth to a genre that can oftentimes feel a bit oversaturated. They are simple to learn, but having a bunch of passive systems interact with one another means that with smart deck building, there is an infinite ceiling of possibilities depending on what the full card pool at launch will look like, while simultaneously being easy to pick up and start playing. Unfortunately, the demo doesn't include any kind of deck building, and instead sees us using pre-constructed decks, each with its own unique themes and characters. But there already looks to be a pretty decent sized amount of variation, so I'm pretty excited to see what the game is going to look like when it fully releases. And with all that said, let's talk about the factions that are available right now. If you played the previous demo for Warpforge, you may be pleasantly surprised to see an entirely new faction, the Necrons of the Sawtech Dynasty. Now, these guys are all about summoning up legions of supernaturally durable, immortal warriors that constantly regenerate from even the most grievous of injuries, and even have the ability to return from the dead. This comes in the form of two unique card attributes: Regeneration, which allows a troop to passively regenerate from wounds at the start of each turn, and Remnant. Cards with the Remnant attribute will leave behind a remnant when they are killed on the battlefield. These stick around until the end of the Necron player's next turn, giving them the opportunity to play cards that bring them back to life. However, the enemy can destroy these by doing at least 1 point of damage to them. This may seem like a negative, but the enemy has to make a choice. Do I sacrifice attacks that could have gone to the enemy general, or give them the opportunity to resurrect their fallen troops? Either way, it's a win-win for the Necron player. The Necrons also have the triggered ability known as Artifice on a lot of their cards. This causes their troops to create secondary bonuses whenever the player drops a stratagem card. Stratagems work like instants and sorceries if you're familiar with Magic. One-time effect spell cards that, after they're played, resolve their effects and then go to the discard pile. The Necron playstyle is about being super durable and throwing tons of stratagems to buff your troops into oblivion. They're great for people who love grinding their opponents down and wars of attrition. Their playable warlords include Imhotep the Stormlord, Nemesaur Zadrek, and Orikan the Diviner. The Stormlord always has the ability to throw down a bolt of lightning that deals 1 damage to a random enemy and heals himself. The Nemesaur can always summon in a Necron warrior, and Orikan has the ability to choose a card from his deck and put it on the top of his card stack. Now, the demo seems to have this be limited to only 3 cards, and I don't know if this is how it's going to be in the full release of the game. But I will point out to all of my Magic playing brothers and sisters out there, Orikan can basically cast a tutor type spell literally every turn. In these pre-constructed decks, it's not as broken as it sounds, but I could see this guy potentially being one of the best characters in the entire game if it literally just lets you get any card you want at the full release. The Orks of the Goth clan are up next, and they have a hyper-aggressive playstyle that specializes in filling the board with lots of troops who hit wicked hard in melee. They have 2 special card attributes unique to their faction: Tide and Mob. Tide cards allow you to play additional copies of a card after casting them. Most of the time in games like this, when you draw a low-cost card late in the game, it feels like a disappointment. You'd much rather be dropping something super powerful to take advantage of all your resources. Not true with the Orks. Since you can cast it multiple times, it means that low-cost cards are always valuable. For example, if you play an Orc Boy that costs 2 but has Tide 4, you can play up to 4 copies of that Orc with only a single card, so long as you have the resources to pay for the cost multiple times. This may not sound like a big deal, but it's incredibly powerful and makes the Orcs into a super threat late in the game. Mob is another one of their special attributes that is triggered whenever an Orc card makes a melee attack. A common example of this is dealing additional damage to a random enemy. If you have 5 cards on the field with Mob, all you have to do is make a melee attack with a single troop, and the Mob effect will trigger on all of your Orcs. This can really catch your opponent off guard and makes the Orcs punch well above their weight. Not to mention the fact that it doesn't just trigger once, it triggers whenever any of your Orcs make a melee attack. So 5 Orcs with Mob are each going to trigger their mob effect 5 times after each one of them makes a melee attack. Quite frankly, their damage output can get hilariously stupid. The hyper-aggressive nature of the Orks is further exemplified by the Ork player always going first. The playable warlords include Gruk Faceripper, who can always draw an extra troop, Boss Zagstruck, who can give himself +1 attack and flying until the end of turn, and the Prophet of Wog himself, Gazkol Throcka, whose special ability increases the attack value of all of his troops permanently by 1. The final faction available in the demo is the Ultramarines, and they're all about efficient use of resources. Many of their cards have the Codex ability, which triggers additional effects when you successfully manage to spend every last point of your energy. Their playstyle highly prioritizes playing combinations of cards to never leave any energy unspent. And these effects can be pretty powerful, such as the one on the Primaris Chaplain, for example, that gives all of your troops a permanent +1 strength on both their physical and ranged attacks. The Impulsor, on the other hand, generates an Intercessor, and the Primaris Eliminator gives the Sniper special rule to all of your troops. To further exemplify the Ultramarines' efficiency, they have another unique card attribute known as Rally. Rally is probably the most straightforward of all of these attributes I've seen so far, and it causes a secondary effect to take place as soon as the troop enters the field. Whether this take the form of offering armor to adjacent allies, or just dealing a free burst of damage against an enemy target, it's like having every one of your troops come with a free stratagem card whenever you play them. Their playable warlords include Uriel Ventus, Marneus Calgar, and Varro Tigerius. Uriel has the ability to play a card that deals 1 damage to any target. Varro has the ability to generate a psychic power card on every turn, while Marneus can just straight up draw an additional card. Despite how much fun I had with this game, there are a couple of minor annoyances that cropped up for me. For one, sometimes effects weren't 100% clear on whether or not they would last indefinitely or until the end of the turn. Additionally, special card effects like flying grant the troop the defensive ability that they can't be targeted with melee attacks. This makes a lot of sense, but I feel like if there's another troop with flying, then they should be able to melee the flying creature. That's how it works in every other card game with a flying mechanic, and it's how it's worked in the tabletop game of 40K for years. You can't melee a plane, that makes sense, I get it. But if I have a jump pack and a thunderhammer, you can bet I'm gonna smash that plane into oblivion. But for some reason, it's not how it works in Warpforge, which is a little disappointing. As a Magic player, the fact that damage didn't just go away on my characters took a little bit of getting used to, and the fact that any of your creatures can target any other creature at any point means that you can't just turtle up and start building up an unstoppable army. Your opponent always has the ability to take out your troops, and this forces the both of you to have to deal with threats immediately as they come up, or they'll start to get out of control. It's not uncommon to see a player's entire side of the board wiped out after the end of every other turn, forcing them to come back rebuilding bigger and stronger with the additional resources that they have. This is kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it means that the battles are a lot more engaging. You don't have 2 players just sitting there turtling up and trying to stack a bunch of card effects together to do one massive play that ends the game. But on the other hand, it was a little bit frustrating whenever I was sitting there with a whole bunch of cards ready to do something cool with a stratagem, only to have them continuously wiped out and never really getting to do that awesome combo. The biggest annoyance by far was the fact that there was a time limit on each of your turns. You only have around 60 seconds to play all of your cards before it switches to your opponent's turn. I understand the use of something like this in multiplayer, so one player doesn't just end up dragging the game out trying to get their opponent to surrender. But this was a single player experience. You can't even pause the game. It just keeps on ticking away in the background. This isn't Dark Souls. I should be able to pause a card game, and I really hope this doesn't make it into the final game for any kind of single player campaign. I'm being nitpicky, and I'm sure things like this will either get ironed out with updated tooltips, or when I actually get to build my own deck, I'll be able to make something that fits my playstyle a lot better. The gameplay of Warhammer 40,000 Warpforge is absolutely stellar. The bones are here for a fantastic card game, and I'm really excited to see what it's going to look like upon its full release. But as many of us know, and this is especially a problem with 40K games, great foundations aren't always enough to keep players engaged forever. The demo doesn't allow you to build your own deck, and instead has you playing with one of several pre-constructed ones. Each of these decks feels super unique, even when you're playing within the same faction. And it's fun to jump around and try out all the different ones. But it's still unknown what the progression system of this game is actually going to look like when we finally get to build our own decks and start unlocking cards. Considering that the game is free to play, I assume that it's going to have a bunch of microtransactions where you're able to buy packs of digital cards, which is not something I'm inherently against, as long as I feel like it's a good value, and I still am able to earn all of these cards by just playing the game. All those unknowns aside, I can definitely say that the core of what Warpforge is great. The matches are fast-paced and a ton of fun. Combat is just swingy enough that even when the chips are down, you don't ever feel like you're completely out of the match. But it's not so swingy that you feel like you aren't rewarded for smart plays. The animation, the music, the voice acting, and the backgrounds all truly capture the essence of what 40K is, and quite honestly, this very well could be what I've always wanted out of a card game. But we'll just have to see what it looks like when the game fully releases. The developers have informed me that they have plans for a lot of additional factions in the future, whether that be entirely new races or new sub-factions like extra dynasties for the Necrons or clans for the Orks. I'm excited to see what they come up with, and I'm sure we're gonna get a lot of the most popular factions. And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about that. You give me some Chaos decks and maybe the ability to play as Black Templars, and I'm gonna be super happy. But personally, I hope they eventually get weird with it. I want to see some obscure factions like the Exodite Eldar or the Dark Mechanicum. Probably will never happen, and if it does, it'll be way off in the future, but I can dream. The demo I'm playing right now is live on Steam until January 22nd, so I encourage you to download it and give it a shot for yourself. It's a lot of fun and it's free to play, so you really have no reason not to try it out. And what do you guys think? Is this a game that you're excited for, or is it one that you didn't even know existed until this video? If you're a big fan of card games like this one, what are some mechanics that you hope make it into the game? Likewise, if you're a big fan of 40K, what are some characters or factions you hope get added in the future? Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below, because I'm curious on what you guys think. Thanks again for watching the video all the way through, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.